Alright, the CEPA Foundation and the INGAA Foundation Incorporated Practical Guide for Pipeline Construction Inspectors, published March 2016. Acknowledgements. Table of Contents. 1. Introduction. 2. Purpose. 3. Scope. 4. Revision of the document. 5. How to use the document. 6. Pipeline Construction Inspector Foundation Information Foundational Information Authority Code of Conduct. Worker site construction safety, quality deficiencies, nonconformance procedures, escalation process, personal violations, environmental consideration, execution of work administration, contractual obligation, records of management, personal qualifications, certifications, equipment calibration, incident reporting, reference foundation information, survey overview, inputs, execution, output, detail, checklist, surveying, type of input, requirements for survey inspection, best practices for item inspection, typical survey operations, typical output, survey inspection, references, survey. 8. Clearing, grading, overview, inputs, execution, outputs, detailed checklist, grading, clearing and grading. 8.5. Typical input requirements, clearing, grading, inspection. 8.6. Basic practice items for inspection, type, clearing, grading, operations. 8.7. Type of outputs, clearing, grading, inspection, reference, clearing, grading. 9. Stockpiling and stringing, overview, inputs, execution, outputs, detailed checklist, stockpiling, string lining, typical input, string lining, stockpiling, inspection, best practice, typical and stringing and stockpiling, inspection, typical output, stockpiling and stringing, inspection, reference, stockpile, stringing. R10, field bending, overview, inputs, execution, outputs, detailed checklist, field bending, typical input requirements of field bending, inspection, best practice for inspection, typical field bending operations, typical outputs, field bending, inspection. Reference, field bending, ditch excavation, overview, inputs, execution, outputs, detailed checklist, ditch excavation, ditching and excavation, typical input requirement of ditching, excavation, inspection. Best practice for the inspection, typical ditch and excavation operation, typical output of ditch and excavation inspection, references ditching and excavation. 12. Welding, overview, input, execution, output, detailed checklist, welding, typical input, requirements of welding inspection, best practice items, inspection, typical welding operation, typical outputs, welding inspection, references welding, coding, overview, input, execution, output, detailed checklist, coding, typical requirement of coding, inspection, best practice items, typical coding operation, typical output, coding, inspection, reference coding, lowering in, overview, input, execution, outputs, detailed checklist, lowering in, typical input, lowering in, and inspection, best practices for inspection, typical lowering in operation, typical output, lowering in inspection references, lowering in, backfilling, overview, input, execution, output, detailed checklist, backfilling, typical inspection, backfilling, inspection, best practice inspection, typical backfilling, operation, typical output, backfilling, inspection, reference, backfilling. 16. Cathodic protection, overview, input, execution, outputs, detailed checklist, cathodic protection. Typical input requirements for cathodic protection, inspection, best practices of the inspection, typical cathodic protection operation, typical output, cathodic protection, inspection, reference, cathodic protection, hydrostatic testing. 17. Overview, input, execution, output, detailed checklist, hydraulic testing, typical input requirements, hydrostatic testing, inspection, best practice for the inspection test, typical hydrostatic testing operation, typical output, hydrostatic testing, inspection, reference, hydrostatic testing. 18. Cleanup, restoration, overview, input, execution, output, detailed checklist, cleanup, restoration, inspection, best practice for the inspection, typical cleanup, restoration operations. 126. Typical output of cleanup, restoration, inspection, reporting, reference, cleanup, and restoration, end note. Alright, 1. This guy provided the detail related with the role of the owner's company pipeline construction inspector in terms of the monitoring and inspection requirements throughout the life cycle of the pipeline construction process. The document is written with the address of the general inspection duties. Area of the special inspection are noted or beyond the scope of the document. The document represents the best practice based on the accumulated experience consensus among the majority of the members of the company in terms of the technical requirements both in Canada and the United States for pipeline construction inspection competency-related tasks beyond the captured in regulation current certification. When anticipated increase in upcoming pipeline construction activity, CEPA of the Canadian Energy Pipeline Association, INGA, foundation established by Pipeline Inspector Certification Work Group as part of the meeting of the number of the key objectives that include introduction of fundamental step changing training qualification pipeline construction inspectors as being with improving the construction quality of the projects, improving overall quality of the work performed in pipeline construction inspector within the industry. The document, particularly with its intended to support some of the broader objective of establishing meaningful reference and enhancing learning of the pipeline construction inspector, complementing with existing industrial knowledge base. The documentation such as recognition alignment with the American Petroleum Institute recommended practices for basic inspection requirement of new pipeline construction, API 1169, Canadian Welding Bureau, CWB, American Welding Society, and NASA International. The purpose of the document is to provide pipeline construction instruction background context beyond existing regulation regarding best practice within the industry. As such, a document is not intended to replace the formal training regulation with a company's specific practice, which may be varied based on individual circumstances rather than intended with a complementary guide to information of these sources. 3. Scope. The scope of the document is limited to gas and liquid pipeline construction. Specifically, content is formed on those items that are relevant to the role of pipeline construction inspector as relates to best practice within the industry. 4. Revisions to this document. The document will be reviewed periodically as per existing CEPA with the foundation practice to ensure that the content will remain relevant and accurate. However, the remains responsible to the user ensure most current version of the documents, codes, and standards are referenced where appropriate. Alright, 5. How to use this document. When practicality, ease of use of the document is organized, reflect with the typical construction process, the transmission line, fundamental information common in all aspects of the construction, with the presented first and followed by the chapter specifically each phase of the construction, with each of the 5 main headings are used consistently. Overview, the brief description, brief description, specific activity, the construction phrase, input, detailed information regarding typical information inspector will require, execution, detailed information regarding items that the inspector should typically watch for ease of use, and items are typically formulated as actions using verbs such as ensure, monitor, confirm, and check, etc. Output, detailed information list of typically information that the inspector will be required to produce for the owner of the company. Reference list of key re-reference documents for those seeking additional information for each of the phases of the construction. The input section within each chapter is intended to clearly identify the type of the document, specification, other information each inspector would likely need. The reference within that phase of the construction execution section with each of the chapter provide a detailed checklist or other grouped by major topic, identifying critical items that the inspector should monitor for the construction phase. Finally, output section within each of the chapter articulates the items that the inspector expected to reproduce and report on as a result of a particular phase of the construction project. The use of the word ensure throughout the document is intended to convey that the inspectors ensure that the contractor has performed inspected work properly through observing, monitoring, assessing, evaluating, verifying, deciding, resolving, reporting, documenting to ensure that the project requirements are met. R6, pipeline constructor inspection fundamental information, and I just want to see how long this chapter is. Okay, we'll cut the tape there. We seem to start our introduction, and we'll start out with 6.